Good afternoon. Welcome to Grade 12 English First Additional Language. Today we continue with the series of lessons on Macbeth. Please have your Macbeth book and notes with you that you can follow and add notes as I'm explaining. So it's a beautiful day to learn something new. Act 3, Scene 2. First Lady Macbeth and then Macbeth express feelings of insecurity and a wish to be dead rather than to live in insecurity and unhappiness. Here we can see that she truly loves her husband and that she's sad that they are no longer close. Lady Macbeth, putting her own feelings aside, advises her husband to put his anxieties aside and to be particularly cheerful among his guests that night. He, in turn, tells her to show particular hospitality to Banquo, knowing fully well that he will be dead by then. Macbeth tells his wife that a dreadful deed will be done that evening, but he does not involve her in the plot to murder Banquo. Now we ended our previous lesson with Act 3, Scene 1, where Macbeth met with the murderers and convinced them that they should take revenge on Banquo. Macbeth accepted their promise that they would murder his former friend. And Macbeth reminds the murderers that Fleance must be killed along with his father. And at the end of the scene, Macbeth is satisfied the matter of Banquo's death has been settled. He does not, like in Duncan's case, consider the consequences of the murder. Right, if we look at this first slide, it's the palace at Forres, enter Lady Macbeth and a servant. Now on this slide we see Lady Macbeth expresses despair and she sends a servant to fetch her husband. So the setting is the king's palace and this scene shows the effect of Duncan's murder on Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. The two partners in crime are now drifting apart, both with a death wish. Right, okay, so Lady Macbeth is just asking here, is Banquo gone from court? So, having confirmed from a servant that Banquo has already left, she sends a servant to Macbeth saying she would like to speak to him. So, if he can spare a few moments, and notice that Lady Macbeth basically has to make an appointment with Macbeth. So, the growing isolation is portrayed. And then she goes on, she says, naught had all spent where our desires is got without content. So they have given up everything and they have gained nothing. They have what they wished for, but it does not bring them any happiness or peace of mind. And she further expresses her feelings of insecurity. She says it would be better for them to be dead like Duncan than to live in uncertainty and anxiety for having committed the murder. So she expresses feelings of guilt as well as disappointment. The desired and imagined pleasures of kingship have not been achieved. And now this is what Macbeth has foreseen all along and why he hesitated so long before he committed to the murder. Lady Macbeth, who was so confident that they would not feel any guilt or remorse afterwards, has finally learned the bitter truth. Right, and then Macbeth enters and she addresses him. And she asks, how now, my lord, why do you keep alone? So we can see Macbeth no longer confides in Lady Macbeth. She knows nothing of his interview with the murderers and fancies that since he dismissed the court, he has been brooding alone over Duncan's murder. And Lady Macbeth here hides her real feelings of depression and puts on a mask of happiness and contentment as soon as Macbeth enters the room. And then she goes on and she's saying, you are going over those thoughts that should have died with the person they think of all the time, namely Duncan. She says there's nothing you can do about it. You should put it behind him. Now that's where she says, what's done is done. Now by using the words, what's done is done, she's actually echoing her husband's use of the word done in Act 1, Scene 7, where he says, if it were done when it is done, then it were well. But here the husband and wife begin to realize nothing is done whatsoever. So their sense of closure is just an illusion. Macbeth answers her where he says, "We have scorched the snake, not killed it." So he uses a metaphor here. Macbeth compares the act of murdering Duncan to trying to kill a snake, which threatens one. The snake is used as a symbol of all forces opposing or threatening Macbeth, the forces of law and order, namely Malcolm, Donalbain, Macduff, Banquo, and Fleance, and more. And then he goes on where he says they have not completely removed all the danger. The snake's shallow wounds will heal, meaning law and order, unity, and forces of good will be restored. And they, the Macbeths, will be attacked by all the forces that supported Duncan and are now against them. So we see at this stage that Lady Macbeth outwardly still supports Macbeth, but remorse has kicked in. She is no longer as forceful as she was. And Macbeth senses this and no longer asks her advice and plans Banquo's murder alone. He tries to protect her. Macbeth, who previously had to be encouraged, now he seems hardened and shows no hesitation or any remorse in planning Banquo's and Fleance's murder. Right, there was a question in a paper where the question asked about the metaphor. Explain the metaphor of "we have scorched the snake, not killed it." And there are three possible answers. The first one, a scorched snake is dangerous as it will attack in defense. It remains a threat until it is destroyed. Similarly, Macbeth is afraid that the killing of Duncan is not the end of his problem. Banquo and Fleance must be killed for him to maintain his position as king. Or after the killing of Duncan, Macbeth fears that Banquo and Fleance are threats to the throne of Scotland, the prophecy of the witches. Therefore, he has ordered that they must be killed. Or Macbeth's fear after Duncan's death is that Banquo's children will ascend the throne of Scotland, therefore their deaths are necessary. Right, and now Macbeth continues. We see that Macbeth is so determined and self-centered that he is prepared to let the universe fall to pieces, to let both heaven and earth be destroyed, so to let there be universal chaos if he cannot have his way, which is to have peace of mind. And then Macbeth says he refuses to live in constant fear and be haunted at night by terrible dreams. He would rather cause universal destruction than continue suffering constant fear. He falsely believes that the murder of Banquo and Fleance will give him the necessary peace of mind. And then he says here in the 1, 2, 3, 4 there, better be with the dead, whom we to gain our peace have sent to peace. So they have sent Duncan to peace, that is heaven, so that they could have the satisfaction of achieving their ambition. However, it would be better to be dead than to suffer the constant uncontrolled fear and agony in which they live. So here Macbeth's mind is compared to a torturous instrument, the rack, which was used to stretch and tear apart the limbs of victims. Right, so, and we can see in these last 4 lines, after life's fitful fever, he sleeps well. Treason has done his worst, nor steel, nor poison, malice, domestic, foreign levy, nothing can touch him further. So this is ironic. Macbeth envied Duncan when he was alive, and now he still thinks that Duncan is more fortunate than himself. After the occasional struggles of life, Duncan is dead and can rest peacefully. Duncan can no longer be affected by treacherous attack by a subject of his using a sword or poison, nor steel nor poison. Neither by a treacherous attack from inside his own country or by an army from outside, malice, domestic, foreign. Alright, the country. And these are the things that Macbeth is afraid of. This is what is waiting for him. Right, then Lady Macbeth answers him, and she says she tries to comfort Macbeth and encourage him to calm down. Gentle, my lord. And this shows her love and caring for her husband. She puts aside her own troubles and encourages him to calm down and not look so worried. And she says, sleek over your rugged looks, be bright and jovial among your guests tonight. So Macbeth must disguise his disturbed and worried expression, which is visible to everybody. She urges him to be cheerful and friendly towards his guest at the banquet that night. And then he answers her and he says, I pray be you, let your remembrance apply to Banquo. So he asks her to give special attention and honor to Banquo that night, well knowing that he would be dead by then. But remember, he does not share that with her. So Macbeth most probably wants to hide from his wife his planned murder of Banquo. If so, it also shows his love and care for her. Knowing the state she is in, he's determined not to burden her with the knowledge of yet another horrendous crime. And then he goes on where he says, as they feel unsafe and insecure in their royal position for the time being, they have to avoid suspicion by flattering those who are the greatest source of danger to them. And he says, hide the true feelings behind masks. So again, we have appearance versus reality theme and a clothing image. Right, then Lady Macbeth urges him, you must leave this. Stop thinking like this. And then he goes on and he says, oh, full of scorpions is my mind, dear wife. Thou knowest that Banquo and his fiancé lives. So this metaphor of the scorpions describes Macbeth's mind as full of terrible thoughts of fear and death. It is as if scorpions are continuously eating into it. And Macbeth hints at his evil plans when he says that Banquo and fiancé are still alive. Now Lady Macbeth answers, but they cannot live forever. And Macbeth answers, there is comfort yet. That is what reassures him. They can be attacked. And then he goes on to tell her, be cheerful or joyful. So this speech shows Macbeth as more assertive, taking charge, comforting Lady Macbeth, in contrast to their earlier roles. And then he used a lot of images of darkness and evil, things that take place under cover of darkness, right? And then he ends up with the words, a deed of dreadful note. A terrible deed will be done that will be long remembered for its horror. And she immediately asked the question, what's to be done? So she's asking what's going to happen. So it's an indication that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are drifting apart. Formerly, he used to consult her about everything he did. And it was she, not he, who took the initiative. Now he has planned Banquo's murder without even consulting her. But instead of giving her all the information, he said, be innocent of the knowledge, dearest Chuck. He uses a term of endearment. He shows his love and caring, but he says, till thou applaud the deed, don't get involved until you praise what has been done. So he firmly believes she will approve and support the killing of Banquo and fiancé, right? And then he goes on, come sealing night. Okay, so night is to hide this dreadful deed from the light. And he goes on, he says, scarf up the tender eye of pitiful day. He wishes to blindfold the sun, as well as to destroy all feelings of pity. So cover the light, cover the sun, so that no one can see and pity the terrible thing that will be done. The word scarf is again a clothing image associated with covering up or concealment. And then he says, and with thy bloody and invisible hand, the murder will be performed under the cover of darkness. Cancel and tear to pieces that great bond. Now, the cancelling of a bond, in this case, Banquo's lease of life, is a legal image which refers to the end of Banquo's lifespan. So he's going to murder him, right? And then he says it grows darker. And then he used the image of a crow. Now, a crow is associated with death. He says the use of the word crow is an extended image of night creatures associated with evil. So we see from this slide and the previous slide that the fact that Macbeth does not tell his wife about his plans shows us Lady Macbeth no longer has the power to influence Macbeth. The achievement of their unlawful ambition through murder has destroyed their relationship, their security, and their peace of mind. Now, he started on the previous slide with, and the crow makes wing to the rooky wood. So the crow flies home to the woods. The gentle creatures of the day are falling asleep, while night's predators are waking up to look for their prey. And then here he says to her, thou marvelest at my words. So he says, it looks like you are astonished by my words, but don't worry, be silent and patient. Deeds that begin with evil are strengthened by more evil deeds to avoid discovery. So the theme of accelerating evil is emphasized. Macbeth sinks deeper into crime. Having overcome his moral restraints to commit Duncan's murder, the murder of Banquo requires no long soul-searching soliloquy about the consequences of evil. In this scene, both Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are more concerned about their own feelings of insecurity and lack of fulfillment than they seem to be with the sin of their crimes. We move over to Act 3, Scene 3. Now, the two murderers waiting to ambush Banquo and Fleance are joined by a third murderer who claims to have been sent by Macbeth. Now, very important, the fact that he sent a third person proves that Macbeth does not even trust his hirelings. That is why a third murderer is introduced. An unsuspecting Banquo and his son Fleance enter. Banquo is killed, but under cover of darkness, Fleance escapes. The prophecy regarding Banquo can thus still come true, and the murderers leave to report back to Macbeth. Now, it's a park near the palace, and it's three murderers that enters. Now, the use of the murderers play a very important role. They reveal how evil Macbeth has become. He has declined from a soldier, a noble soldier, brave man, fighting for his king, to murderer of his king. And he now hires killers to kill his friend and former comrade. This scene also reveals the fact that he is suspicious and does not trust anybody. He has hired a third murderer to ensure the successful murder of Banquo and Fleance. The importance of this scene to the plot is that Fleance escapes, which means that the prophecy that Banquo could be the father of many kings can still come true. Macbeth has been unable to defeat fate. The three murderers, but who did bid thee join us? So the two murderers waiting for Banquo and Fleance to show up are joined by a third man who claims that Macbeth has sent him. He says, Macbeth. So Macbeth clearly, as I said, trusts nobody and wants to make doubly sure that Banquo and Fleance is indeed killed. And then after the third murderer answered that Macbeth sent him, the second murderer says he needs not our mistrust. So the third murderer could have been sent both to deliver final instructions and to help them with the crime, and they decided that they can trust him as he knows exactly what they have been instructed to do. And then the first murderer says, well then stand with us. The west yet glimmers with some streaks of day. The sun is setting. And then he says, now spurs the later traveller apace to gain the timely inn, and near approaches the subject of our watch. So they are waiting for Banquo at the appointed time and place that Macbeth gave them, and they imagine that he is currently spurring on his horse to move faster to reach his destination before dark. So they are waiting there for Banquo and Fleance to arrive. And then the third murderer says, I hear horses. And they hear Banquo's voice. Within means it happens off stage. So you can only hear Banquo's voice. You do not see him. Give us a light. So Banquo and Fleance approach on foot, having given their horses to grooms, and start walking the last part back to the castle. Right, and then the second murderer says, well, this must be Banquo, because the rest of the expected guests are already at the castle. Note of expectation already are in the court. The rest of the guests are already at the castle. And the murderer says, well, the grooms are taking their horses to the stable, while Banquo and Fleance walk to the castle. And then he just adds, he usually walks from there to the palace, because it's customary to walk the last mile to the palace. And then the second murderer sees something, a light. And then Banquo and Fleance appears with a torch. So they appear carrying a torch. Remember, Banquo and Fleance are associated with light, integrity, and goodness. And third murderer said, it is he. And the first one said, well, it's Banquo, get ready to attack. And Banquo makes a remark, it will rain tonight. He says it's going to rain. It's dark, gloomy weather requested by Macbeth. And the first murderer says, let it come down. So this remark refers both to the rain mentioned by Banquo, the gloomy weather and the rain that is falling, and the large number of blows in quick succession that rains down on Banquo's head. And then Banquo realizes, he's screaming, oh, treachery! Fly, good Fleance, fly, fly! Thou mayst revenge our own slave. So Banquo realizes who's behind this treacherous deed, and he urges Fleance to escape so that he can one day take revenge on his father's murder. And with that, Banquo dies and Fleance escapes. And the third murderer asked the question, who did strike out the light? Who put out the light? Ironically, Fleance escaped in the dark. Darkness was supposed to cover up the murder, but it helped Fleance to escape. And then the first murderer was quite confused, and he says, was it not the way? Was it not what had to be done? So this suggests that the first murderer struck out the light. And then there's but one down, the sun is fled. Banquo is dead, but the sun got away. We have lost best half of our affair. They failed to perform the most important part of their job, killing Fleance, even though they did not know exactly the reason why it was so important. They knew Fleance had to be killed. And then the third murderer says, well, let's away and say how much is done. So now they must go back to Macbeth to report back. This unsuccessful attempt indicates that Macbeth is unable to undo the witch's predictions. So that was the last where we saw Banquo alive. Just a few points to remember about Banquo. Banquo is the major foil to Macbeth in the play. Remember, a foil is a character in literature that contrasts with another character. In this case, Banquo's character is in contrast with Macbeth. And just a few points. Banquo is less willing to believe the witch's predictions than Macbeth. Way in the beginning, when they first encountered the witches, Banquo was the one who did not believe what the witches said. He even went as far as warning Macbeth against the witches when he said, remember, be careful, because they will tell you the truth about a trivial matter, about something that is not so important, to gain your trust. And then they will lie to you about something important. Right, but they gained Macbeth's trust, but not Banquo's. And then, unlike Macbeth, he resists the temptations of evil. The witches made a prediction to Banquo as well. But unlike Macbeth, he resisted the temptation of taking matters into his own hand and by foul play achieving that, make that predictions come true. He did not do that. Banquo was loyal. We see that when he openly declared his loyalty to Duncan when Macbeth questioned him. He's modest, he's honest and trusting, and he was devoted to God. We see that when Duncan's body was discovered, and he said that everyone must go to their rooms, get dressed, and get back so that they can discuss this matter. And there he said that God will help them. He will ask God's assistance in resolving this matter. Right, again, the total contrast to Banquo. And then we see when Macbeth no longer trusts Banquo, he has him brutally murdered. That brings us to the end of today's lesson. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Tomorrow we will continue with Act 3, Scene 4. Have a wonderful afternoon. Make wise choices. Goodbye.